Well, good evening to everybody on Zoom, and a warm welcome to the select few who are at Hillview Church. And it's good to see you all here this evening. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ian Donald, who's a very, how do I say, old friend, long-standing friend, and he's nearly going to be very old. So, who is a retired elderly care physician? Is that the latest term for?
Yeah, probably not the latest term.
But whatever, and he's agreed to come and speak to us about assisted dying and all things related to that. Ian's a great publisher. He did a lot of research when he was working and did a lot of research into frailty and how that impacts elderly patients when they get into hospital, and did a lot of work, and the pathways at the hospital were changed as a result of that work, and he set up a frailty unit so that elderly frail people could be dealt with efficiently and quickly. He's also written a book, a guide to frailty in healthcare in frailty, which he will be referring to later. And he also is doing a course called Aging Gracefully, which has nothing to do with beauty products, but it's more to do with dealing with the aging process in the right way. And perhaps we'll have a few nuggets from that course as well this evening as well. So welcome, Ian, and we look forward to hearing from you in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to pray to start the evening. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this evening. We thank you for Ian and his expertise. And thank you for his preparation. And we look forward to hearing from him, Lord. Just help him as he speaks to us, that we might hear from you and learn more about this topical subject. And so we do pray for Ian now as he brings this talk to us. Amen. I just forgot to say to those that are on Zoom, at the end of the presentation, if you could put any questions you have in the chat, and then Andrew will then relay the questions to Ian here in the church, and then he will answer accordingly. So questions for those that are on Zoom in the chat, please, afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello and good evening to everyone. So you've heard a bit about my background as an elderly care physician, if we're going to call it that. And it's from that perspective that I think I'd like to start as we think about this issue of euthanasia. Our view of aging is coloured quite a lot by our sort of middle-classy experience, which is one that we can expect to have a pretty healthy, vigorous, exciting retirement. We can live for 10 or 20 years like that, hopefully, if health allows. But then when our health doesn't so allow and our health departs, we're therefore tempted to think, I'll have done my bit and that will be it. I'll be happy to make my departure. And our society, you see, is like that. It worships vitality, it worships youthfulness. And it's very easy to start to think that old age won't really have any value as soon as we encounter those kind of difficulties. I think it's the opposite. I think older people have a really special contribution to make to society. And that's not just measured by what we do. It's by who we are and what we bring to society, to our friends, to our neighborhood. And it's not just, as I say, in doing things, although yes, I know for many in retirement, doing things such as volunteering. We run churches very often. We're pretty important in many charities. We're pretty important in looking after the grandchildren sometimes. But as I say, it shouldn't just be by what we are doing, but also just who we are. Because there's a fear of being old. And if we're honest, because we're wrapped into this sort of society, we're all affected by this to some way, of being frightened of the idea of being old. Do you know, it was 20 years ago that Baroness Julia Neuberger said, I believe we'll see limited euthanasia in the UK in the next decade. The climate of opinion is changing. What we need to think about is to what extent this is because of people's fear of growing old and helpless, their fear of the disintegration of self and of society's unwillingness to accept that it has to pay for the care of the frail and more dependent. So yes, as Dave said, I've been running a course over the last year or so called Aging Gracefully. It's sort of theology, but it tries to unpick a little bit around what we think and feel about all these issues. And we start the course very often with asking, what is your greatest fear of growing old? And what do I hear? I hear losing independence, first of all, becoming a burden on others. Yet, once we start talking about that, very quickly people, of course, will also interject that, well, actually, it was a privilege to help look after Mum through that illness. It gave me a new perspective on things. We grew closer during that time. It's not always a burden. Let's think about deaths generally. So I think the number is 670,000 deaths in the UK each year. Do you know what the average age of death is? Well, about 50% of deaths are over the age of 80. So the majority of deaths are in, old age, what I call the fourth age. The most common age, the mathematicians call that the median, the mode of death. The most common age of dying is now 86. So if you watch the Times and see when, if you follow, my wife loves to follow all those obituaries. 86 is the most common age. What's the most common cause? Probably, certainly for older people, it's dementia now. I think there was a trend for saying old age. Just put that in your say. You're allowed to say old age. You don't have to medicalize it, but dementia is probably the most common. Okay, let's start addressing this euthanasia. Because first of all, where does the clamour for euthanasia come from? Well, I suppose it comes first of all from those extraordinarily extreme cases that we all think, gosh, that's absolutely awful. How on earth would I cope with that? Quite often maybe a motor neuron disease case, where you know just what it's going to be, and maybe quite quickly the deterioration is going to happen. Interestingly, the Motor Neuron Disease Society is still neutral on the issue, so they recognize that some will feel that way, but many won't. So there's those awful cases, and if you listen to the House of Commons debate recently, then quite a few people who were speaking most passionately did so as they referred to a particular case where they found it really, really tough sitting alongside, and possibly felt that the health service or palliative care failed them in that situation. And so the second main reason for euthanasia is really compassion, isn't it? It appeals to us as Christians. Surely, you get all these sort of phrases, you wouldn't let a dog suffer like that, or whatever, these funny sort of phrases. But witnessing a really tough death, and you think, surely someone could have been more compassionate in there. And we'll explore these things in a minute. Thirdly, autonomy. This funny thing, autonomy. We need to explore that in some depth this evening. It's my life. I'm free to do with it how I like. Very strong feelings of that, of autonomy, individualism. And I think over all this thing of fear of being old, actually. Fear about being dement and dependent. So in Oregon, one of the countries where there is legalized euthanasia and where there's some quite good information about what's going on, they've done surveys of people applying for, as it were, enrolling for the program of euthanasia. And what are the main things they say? 80% say fear of loss of dignity. 87% say a loss of autonomy is the reason. Life no longer enjoyable. It's interesting. 85% say that. 40% say a burden on others. Interestingly, only 20% say intolerable suffering or severe pain as being the reason for asking for euthanasia, only 20%. And maybe that fear is linked to another fear, not that didn't come out in the Oregon data, but the fear of being over-treated, the fear of being medicalized, of being kept alive by medical interventions that you really didn't want. Because we have, if we're honest, we have medicalized death to quite a big degree. It's almost that you're in hospital and medics are trying strenuously to postpone death. Well, that's what we're called to do, isn't it? But then it means our death is determined by when the medics finally give in. So it seems to be they are in control. Death has been defined by what doctors can or cannot do. And so the clamour for euthanasia is perhaps people wanting to wrest back control from doctors and to say that's not right. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember Nelson Mandela's death? It's some years ago now, but I remember in the headlines he was dying. He had severe pneumonia. And it had relapses. He was in hospital and then out and then back and so on. He was on a ventilator. And there were we were getting frequent headlines about it. The headlines, at least in South Africa, were, fears growing over Nelson Mandela, and he was 93. And, yes, he was actually, I know he was obviously a desperately important figure in South Africa, but yes, he would also die. And so it was a great struggle, and he died. And after that, Desmond Tutu, again, who we all respect hugely, Bishop Desmond Tutu, said that it had been a terrible experience for him, drawn out suffering, and that no one should have to go through that. And he then started calling for euthanasia in South Africa as the answer to that, because of that sense of over-medicalization. Maybe a minute or two just on terms. I'm afraid we'll have to do that a little bit tedious, but again, if you listen to the House of Commons debate, you'll have realized there was a bit of confusion over just what is and what isn't euthanasia. So first of all, it's not these things. It's not omitting a treatment. Even it's not omitting a treatment that might prolong life. Why is that? Well, for instance, it may just be that although that might prolong life, it wouldn't really serve any real benefit to the person's experience of life. It might only prolong life for a few weeks. Or it might simply be that a person doesn't want to have that treatment. And you're allowed to say, I don't want this treatment. That is not euthanasia. You're allowed to just say, I do not want any further treatment. So that's common. And likewise, therefore, the same thing is withdrawing a treatment, perhaps because it's perceived not to really be helping the person feel any better, or perhaps, again, simply because the person doesn't want to have that treatment any longer. That's not euthanasia. More difficult is the in-betweeny, which is giving a treatment which might hasten death, but it wasn't the reason we were giving it. This is sort of complicated. So in other words, it's looking at the motive behind giving that treatment. The motive was to make the person feel more comfortable, but it might be that it could hasten death. I don't know if some people here will remember the Gosport Memorial Hospital inquiries from the 1990s, I think, where it's a geriatric hospital where there were a lot of deaths, actually really quite large numbers of deaths, of some old people who'd been admitted, for instance, just for respite care, and they'd gone on to end-of-life drugs, essentially. They'd been given injections of morphine and so on. And I think it was pretty certain to most of us looking at it that there was awfully bad practice going on and a misjudgment. No one could quite decide. It was never proven in the courts that the motive had been to hasten death. And so no one was prosecuted, but it was very borderline. And It led in part to the Liverpool Care Pathway. You've heard about that as well. Again, it subsequently got bad press, but of course the Liverpool Care Pathway partly came in to regulate and advise people to say, okay, let's make sure we're using the right doses, because these drugs like diamorphine, if they're given in the right dose and escalated in the right manner, they really do not, they're not euthanasia. They really are not. But if given wrongly, in the wrong doses and the wrong time and so on, they could hasten death. I think that was admitted. So these things are difficult, but then the care pathway came into bad, but it was actually trying to do good, it was trying to do good things, trying to advise on the right level. And then of course we could say Shipman, but then you see so there's kind of Gosport, Liverpool Care Pathway, Shipman. The Shipman, that we definitely know what the motive was, but he was again doing the same sort of thing, injecting those drugs. So giving a treatment with the intention of relieving symptoms is not what we're talking about in euthanasia. What is euthanasia? Well, again, we have to subdivide that a little bit. So there's assisted suicide or assisted death. In the debate in the Commons, they want to call it assisted death. I think some of us want to call it assisted suicide, same thing. There's assisted death by a non-medic, and there's assisted death by a medic, so that's called physician-assisted suicide. So those, then euthanasia is reserved for where a medic has actually given the treatment. The assisting, you're just providing the pill, providing the injection, well, it wouldn't be an injection, providing the liquid or the pills for a person to take. You might say, yeah, what's the difference? But anyway, euthanasia is where the doctor literally does it. So it sounds pretty much like the death sentence in America. It's an injection, okay? So those are those bits. So, okay, how common is it? Where is it happening? In 13 countries, 31 jurisdictions at the moment. Interestingly, pretty much sort of Western world. So it's Europe, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, really. So that's where it's happening, which is interestingly a sort of similar approach to life, I think one might say, in those countries. It varies a bit in whether it's euthanasia or whether it's physician-assisted. So in Canada, Belgium and Luxembourg, it's predominantly euthanasia. Doctors do it. In Holland and Australia, it's physician-assisted. The proposal here is it should be physician-assisted. And then the criteria vary, and I'm not going to go into that, but they vary. Some say it's for terrible suffering. Some say it's because the end of life is coming near. Some say you have to have both of those things. Some say just bad suffering. Doesn't matter whether they're dying or not. The most worrisome thing is that in Holland recently, they've added people who are in what we call incompetent, people who are not able to actually say yes and agree at this time. They probably wrote something in the past, but that feels a little bit concerning. What some of us refer to as the slippery slope in all of this, that it starts as one thing. And certainly in Canada, very rapidly it's gone from, it started well-defined, and in a matter of a few years, it's included more and more people, because it gets a bit, how can you say 6 months? Well, what about if the doctor said it was 8 months? Right? Shouldn't I be included, and that sort of thing. Or if you try to have an age on it or whatever, you sort of say only people who are over 20, or what about a 19-year-old? Or if you said only people over 18, what about a 17 and a half? So on the whole, legal people find that very difficult, so the law tends to push it down what people refer to as the slippery slope. Of course, none of this is new, is it? Do people know Anthony Trollope's fixed period? Heard of that? So I don't think old people were regarded too well in Victorian society. Anthony Trollope wrote his book, The Fixed Period, in the end of the 19th century. So it talks about a land called Britannulia. And in Britannulia, when you were 68, you were sent to a college of sort of learning and preparation for death. And then at 69, you were popped off. That was what he wrote in that fiction book called The Fixed Period. There wouldn't be many people in this audience, actually. Britannulia. There we are. And of course, do people remember the film Logan's Run? Logan's Run? I think that was the age of 30. All these sorts of fictional things saying, is that the solution to an aging society? And it does make us think whether we know the solution to an aging society and to what extent these sorts of changes are another way of talking about the solution to an aging society. But, okay, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about autonomy and then compassion and then sanctity of life. See how we get on. Autonomy, this sort of individualism that has become the identity of our society, really, isn't it? That we are that we're responsible for making our own decisions, and that we are individuals. So we, when you compare it to, say, 200 years ago, where people would probably dress much the same or much less individualistic, this autonomy is really about being an individual. And Christians are probably okay with that in a way. When you sort of first think about it, you think, well, we're okay with free will. We're okay with a sense that we should make choices, that we're responsible for what happens to ourselves. And one could argue that it's the logical conclusion of that sort of autonomy that you should make decisions about the end of your life, that it's my life. Those people who are very individualistic are obviously thinking much more about me than they are about the people around them and about their contribution to that society and so on, that neighborhood. I suppose in the past, maybe not that long past, we used to say doctor knows best. But individualism means, no, I know best. Actually, if we go really far back, I suppose we would have said vicar knows best, wouldn't we? But anyway. But it's, when we say it's free will, it's not just a whim of choice, is it? It can't just be on a whim. I've just decided I'd like euthanasia today. It's not a whim. It must be what doctors would call informed consent. It must be informed. You've thought it through. Well, how much will people have thought it through? How much do you have to have thought it through to be reasonable or to be informed, as we would say? Doctors are used to that sort of sense of how much information do you need to make a good decision. Because some people are going to be vulnerable to that, aren't they? They're not going to be able to absorb the information. Some might be nudged along, as we are very often tempted to do as doctors, in being a little bit paternalistic, and that feels all right because we're trying to help them get there, but it's complicated, isn't it? A little bit of paternalism is sometimes needed to help people understand the choices they're making. And there are influences in all that. So in the current debates about all of this, we call it coercion. We could just call it influence. Your decision is not made in a vacuum. Your decision is influenced by who you are and the experiences you've had in life and your family and all these sorts of things. It's also influenced by external things, perhaps in this regard, how wealthy you are, perhaps how much support you've had in terms of illness in palliative care and so on. It might be influenced by your sense of duty, might be influenced by your sense of depression. All sorts of things are going to influence internally and externally how you come to that informed choice. And we know that at the end of the day, it's not completely independent. You're making that decision, but it's influenced by all these things, and no man is an island. And you know that there are going to be consequences on other people. We only need to look at suicides and think of the impact that that has on families and so on. That you can't pretend that you're doing this thing in isolation. In fact, it's extraordinary that the current bill doesn't insist that the family are informed. You could actually proceed with it without letting the family know. And indeed, you could have a doctor signing all the stuff for you who doesn't actually know you either. So you're trying to pretend that you can be an island, and yet how can that be then a good informed choice? Okay, that's a little bit about autonomy. Compassion perhaps appeals stronger to the heartstrings of the Christian in all of this. We're called surely to show compassion and love to everyone. It motivates us in healthcare and in palliative care. And we have to admit that palliative care can't remove all the suffering. Maybe it can remove a pretty high chunk of the pain, but what about just the suffering, the indignities, just the whole experience? We can't pretend that it can take away all of that. And there's surely other examples, aren't there, of justified mercy killing. And I suppose that then takes us to think of sort of battlefield type situations or so on. We think that Jesus said, no man has greater love than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. That sometimes self-sacrifice to save being a burden on others, you sort of think. So you can sort of think, yes, you might be convincing me there. And indeed, some might argue that a more peaceful death might be possible by choosing to have assisted dying in your own home than possibly facing some of the experiences that we know can sometimes happen in hospital. Either there wasn't enough staff around to give you, or there wasn't enough palliative care, or just you were being over-medicalized like we mentioned before. Actually, it's true that after deaths in hospital, we do a thing called a mortality review. So we review sort of how it was all handled and so on. And certainly in my department, it was very common that when you did that, we found we really should have spotted that she was dying quite a bit earlier. And that might well have changed how we'd handled things and how we'd said. So we do recognize that. But there are problems with the compassion argument as well, aren't there? I mean, just as it's difficult to say you've made your decision without any coercion or any influence from other people, so compassion, did you make that decision in a wholly compassionate way? Were there ulterior motives? And if you were assisting with it, there might be ulterior motives. Not that I would ever say that that was the case, but it would be quite nice not to have to be visiting mum every other day. Yes, but there could, they're just going to be under the surface, aren't they? And sometimes in hospital, you may be thinking it would free up a bed. You're not going to say that, and no one's going to feel that, but aware of the pressures in the system. Difficult to say it's wholly compassionate. And it's not right, is it, that compassionate families, and we recognize they are compassionate families, going to huge trouble and risk taking their loved one to Switzerland, to Dignitas. And yes, okay, we've got a compassionate interpretation of the law, so on the whole those people won't be prosecuted. But nevertheless, they need a lot of courage, a lot of money, I should think. And so that's not right that that should be available to a small sector of the community. And I think that argument is a strong one at the moment. Perhaps it's difficult measuring suffering. It's interesting, the current law a current proposal doesn't include any measure of suffering, because I mean, can we actually measure suffering? You might say it's justified where there's intolerable suffering, and yet who's going to measure that? Who's going to say what is intolerable? I'm sure you've done the same. You've looked at some people maybe somebody that you've seen in the street or on an occasion or on a film, and you thought, gosh, how on earth do they live like that? And our imaginators are sort of able-bodied, is you can't imagine life being worth living like that. But then not all of those are, committing suicide or whatever. They do find meaning. And so it's very difficult for us to impart our judgment on other people, and possibly not right. And then I suppose a Christian might want to say that, of course, there is a place for suffering. We talk about this in our aging course and trying to think how to pray for people who are going through illnesses and challenges of old age. And suffering will sometimes have a meaning. It's not very fashionable to be sort of saying that today. And maybe that's, as I say, a rather Christian argument, but sometimes going through an illness has an impact that can be positive. There can be things that happen, things can happen in the last weeks of life that can be positive. So it's I think we have to be aware of that. And possibly that if euthanasia were to cut short the opportunity for what might happen, then we might say that's sad. But I think that's a rather Christian and more niche argument, because many people would find that more difficult to accept, that our duty and our desire is not to always relieve suffering as much as we can. Because Christians are really divided in all of this. I'm just going to get some water. Just about everywhere is so divided, but Christians are divided equally. In fact, the majority of Christians think that we should legalize euthanasia. About 70% in most surveys, which is about the same really as the general public. Regular churchgoers, it's said, are about 60% supported, perhaps slightly less. Catholics tend to be slightly lower than Anglicans, but it's not much really. The majority of all are in favour. The middle-aged are most in favour. The elderly are least in favour. So is that selling us something? I don't know. So Christians might want to argue the sanctity of life. Is that a trump card for the Christian? Life is God-given. That the sort of the argument from Genesis and so on, God has given us life, and it's not our place to take the life away. Actually, I struggle with this a little bit. Because it slightly takes you in a direction of wanting to preserve life at all costs, because it was God-breathed, and even a superficial thinking about the role of medicine in society today, you realize that we're frequently interfering with natural death and saving lives. Are we saying that that's wrong? No, I don't think so. We recognize that doctors are saving lives and are making decisions about these things and have responsibility to make good decision. Actually, I think we probably have responsibility to make decisions rather than to be in control, but you might feel that's a rather fine distinction. But the longer you go on in medicine, you learn humility, and that you realize you're not actually in control of things, and you kind of give your advice, and you think you know what's going to happen. And sometimes you have some rather exciting surprises, and that's great. Unfortunately, American surveys seem to show that Christians do hold on to interventions to the very last minute, more so than non-Christians. So if you're a Christian in America, you're more likely to die in an intensive care unit or on a ventilator or whatever than non-Christians. Whether they're sort of still believing that a miracle is going to happen and God is going to intervene, and it would be wrong to do anything that might, before God has had a chance to save you. I don't know. But it's kind of well, this might be going into more difficult theological grounds, but it's whether you view death really as the enemy and that we need to fight Satan and battle on. But I'm not sure that quite fits with my understanding of it. I feel life has a natural cycle to it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a dependency. We become independent, and then we become dependent, and that's the way of it. I think there's a purpose in each part. So what do I understand by sanctity of life? I think it's to emphasize that life has worth, that everyone deserves respect, that therefore there should always be hope, that we're not going to judge who is of worth, or we're not going to be the one who says they'd be better off dead. I think our sanctity for life says I can't say that. We probably could use Bible passages to affirm that, if you like. We probably could use Psalm 139, familiar Psalm 139, thinking about how God had in mind what we were going to be like before even we were born, and he's laid it out and so on. Psalm 139 is worth looking at. And of course, Paul's talks in 1 Corinthians 12, remember, about the body. Maybe I'll just read something. You remember that long passage about all the body parts. And I won't read all of that. Our body have many parts, and God has put each part just where he wants it. How strange a body would it be if it had only one part? So we're thinking about old people or disabled people or demented people. In fact, some parts of the body that seem weakest and least important are actually the most necessary. And the parts we regard as less honourable are those we clothe with the greatest care. So we carefully protect those parts that should not be seen, while the more honourable parts do not require this special care. God has put the body together such that extra honour and care are given to those parts that have less dignity. So think of that in the context of the care that we should give to people that other people might say they'd be better off dead. Here's some words from a palliative care physician called Sheila Cassidy. It's the lavishing of precious resources, our precious ointment on the handicapped, those with mental illness, the rejected and the dying, that most clearly reveals the love of Christ in our times. It is this gratuitous caring, this unilateral declaration of love, which proclaims the gospel more powerfully than bishops and theologians. It is a particular form of Christian madness which seeks out the broken ones, people with dementia, the handicapped and the dying, and places before their astonished eyes a banquet normally reserved for the whole and the productive. It's the hallmark, isn't it? It's the hallmark of a caring Christian society, and it's a realization that we have our worth in relationship. The place of the disabled in our society is a mark of our love and our society. So for some reason, in spite of knowing that, we individually are still frightened of the idea of being dependent. And I think we have to really kind of examine that and spend some time, not just now, but just pondering on that is to try to figure out. We've been sucked into thinking dependency is the one thing we should dread. And yet, having the dependent in our society and having what Sheila Cassidy describes as a society of providing that care is the hallmark of the sort of relationships we want, and I think Jesus wants. Okay, I'm coming towards last comments. My last comments really are going to be are from a sort of medical perspective. And so perhaps 2 or 3 specific things. It's interesting that British Medical Association, which is the biggest medical body that's done a survey of doctors' views and represents, we might have an argument as to whether they represent us, because they've become an increasingly political organization in recent years. But they did a very big survey and found pretty much a 50-50 split amongst doctors. A slight, it was again, I could talk about specific bits on it. About a third would agree to assist suicide, but about a half supported the idea of physician-assisted suicide. The groups that were most against, no surprises there, it was palliative care doctors, geriatricians, and GPs. Who are those people? Those are the people who see the majority of deaths in general and in the home. But some specific issues about medicine. First of all, uncertainty. So I don't know if you think you're hoodwinked into believing certainty, that when a doctor tells you that you've got this diagnosis, or you've got this long to live, or the scan shows things have got worse, you sort of decided that's it, that's the truth, that's all I need to know. The truth is actually much more complicated and much more uncertain than that. They tell you about probabilities. There was a case in the Times newspaper last week, because people are writing in about all of this at the moment quite a lot. Somebody who owes their life to not have this law not being in place, because he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease and said he couldn't face the idea of that, and was considering going to Switzerland, and would willingly have committed suicide himself. He was thinking about it and planning it. But then, in fact, about 6 months later or a year later or whatever it was, the diagnosis got changed to him having just a neuropathy, and he didn't have a progressive condition at all. So he could easily, there's uncertainty. Diagnoses are not absolutely fixed. So there's that one issue. We're really not sure what impact having any law would have on palliative care. There are different things being said around in the different countries where it's happening at the moment. But on the whole, it looks like there would be a disinvestment from palliative care, but that hasn't occurred in every country. But I think what would definitely happen in palliative care, and certainly in hospital care, is that we would have to talk about this being a choice, an option, to people who are wanting to know about what choices and options they have. Doctors are used to talking about you could have this treatment or that treatment, or you could go there or whatever, and try and explain some of the options that are available and risks and benefits and so on. And that we would have to explain that, of course, one thing you could have is we could give you assisted suicide. How is that going to come across? How is that going to come across when a palliative care doctor is talking to someone who's full of anxiety and fear and doubts and wondering what on earth is going to happen, and this person trying to show kindness says, well, we could do that. Is that what you think, doctor? Is that what you think? Very difficult. And interestingly, of course, we talked about the fairly kindly DPP guidelines at the moment that allow there to be no prosecution against families who take someone to Switzerland. But those guidelines recommend that if a doctor is involved at all, then there probably should be at least a case to be answered for and the person taken to court, because they realize that the doctor being involved could well be mixed motives and a bit not right and a bit shipman-like. I mean, I don't know. Can we imagine a world where you were one evening walking out on the Clifton Suspension Bridge and you saw somebody there on the edge, clearly what they had in mind was to jump off. And so you have a conversation with them and you listen to their suffering and their situation and you say, you're right, it is pretty awful. I'll help you. Can you imagine it? I mean, I think there are alternatives to all of this. And I think the alternative is in being less medicalized, less medicalizing death, and in encouraging the conversations about dying, so that people can be upfront in saying that they don't want to have treatment. And so let me just read you to a case that I felt brave enough to put in my book, which is called With a Light Touch. June was 84 years old when I met her for the second time. She had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, we used to call chronic bronchitis. She came into hospital from time to time with a lung disease. She was breathless much of the time, had oxygen at home and was confined to the house. I was talking to her on the ward after she'd recovered from the latest severe attack, and we were reviewing the support she had at home. And then, what seemed somewhat out of the blue, she said, "Couldn't you just end my life for me?" Well, of course, no, I couldn't. But we chatted about how she felt. She explained that she'd not really wanted to be treated this time, but didn't know how to say this. I spoke with her family, who said she'd felt like ending her life for a long time now, and would speak about this at home. I realized this was a settled view of hers and her family, and we agreed to complete an advanced care plan which said that she would not have life-saving antibiotics again. Extraordinarily, it was only a week later, and while she was still on the ward waiting for the home care to restart, that a further hospital-acquired infection started. She remained adamant about not having antibiotics, and she died a few days later with treatment to relieve her breathlessness. And I say we'd been slow to listen to June until she was the one courageous enough to speak. So there we are. Perhaps it is down to compassion. Compassion literally means suffering with being alongside suffering, with showing, coming alongside, yes, suffering with. I mean, we think of Christ's passion when we say that, and we think of Christ asking for his disciples to be with him on Thursday evening as he was facing the extraordinary prospect. And surely that's what we're asked to do, to come alongside the suffering and to stick with them rather than to arrange a hasty end. Well, okay, that's my view anyway. Thanks very much.